Goeiemôre almal. Het is lekker om met julle te praat vandag oor cryptogeld, privaat geld, blockchain, ekonomiese politieke implikasies van hierdie goeders. Net om te sê, so ek is by Investec Bank, ek is ekonom en 'n strateeg daar. Die sieninge wat ek gaan deel is persoonlike sieninge. En ek wil eintlik sommer net vroeg skakel na Engels, want ek praat meeste van die tyd in Engels getrou. So het gaan my seker 5 na 10 minute langer vat en ek gaan my reputasie skade doen as ek probeer aanhou in Afrikaans. So the views are personal views. We have lively debates about the stuff in the office at the moment. I've been appointed as the blockchain leader at Investec to do research and strategy and to go through a sort of educational process with management to understand how this technology may or may not disrupt us as a bank, and how we kind of need to play this new world of blockchain, private money, and all this kind of stuff. So the title of my presentation is The Money Revolution. Davy had a great presentation earlier where he spoke about the differences between private and state money. I want to talk a bit about money in the information age, what we're dealing with at the moment with cryptocurrencies and blockchain, what we used to in terms of money and how we operate, and the generational changes I think could be coming from this. This is kind of conflict of battle of ideas. So just to follow up from what Andries said earlier, so Andries was talking about these revolutions that happen with technology through the centuries. So what I find really interesting at the moment is when you look at the Western world and you look at the political turmoil that we're facing, things like Brexit, Catalonia, Scots wanting a referendum, you look at Trump coming into power and a lot of people didn't expect it, at least the mainstream media and kind of establishment commentators didn't really expect it. Like, what's underlying this? We've got a money revolution, but it's really part of a culture revolution as well. And the way that I think about this is to say, every 80 or so years, you get what we call a fourth turning. 80 years is a generational cycle in history. So when you look at what Andries put up on the board in terms of technological changes, if you focus specifically on North America and the changes that it's undergone in the last 300-400 years, look at 1776, which was 20 years before the steam age era. 1776 was the War of Independence in the US. Kick out the Brits, the Redcoats, we go independent, Declaration of Independence, US Constitution, massive reorganization of institutional arrangements in America at the time. You fast forward 80 years to 1850, which is about 20 years before the other big technological changes that came with electricity and the like. We had the Civil War in the US. 1776, 80 years Civil War, 1850, North versus South, abolish slavery, all these things. You fast forward another 80 years, and you're at the Great Depression, World War II era, and you fast forward another 20 years, and you've got the information age, which effectively started then. You fast forward another 80 years, and you are where we are today. So what's really interesting to me about this technology is you've got massive political conflict in a place like America between the left progressives in the coastal areas in the US versus the country class, the more sort of, normal middle-class American, more practically oriented, they can do more stuff with their hands, they don't care about their zip code or whether they went to Harvard or Princeton or any of the stuff, who are more center-right and care more about freedom and want to go back to an America where you didn't have this big state dictating how everything would be. So there's a massive culture conflict that's in effect playing out. Typically, when you go back in time, when you have these big culture conflicts, it results in war. We may not need a war to give everybody what they want, and you can use these technologies in order to rearrange society and the institutions in a way that suits you, that keeps you happy. And so that's why I think this is such an important technology. And it doesn't only apply to North America, but applies to the whole world. So, like Skalk and Neil said, the guys from Catalonia looking for freedom, they left progressives, more socialist-minded, the guys from the Catalonia government, but it doesn't care because they're looking to this technology to get freedom. It doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum, you're going to turn to this technology to design freedom. So, first off, I just want to contrast the information age and what we have in terms of connectedness in the world today. So this is a picture of Facebook's user connections around the world, which I find fascinating. It's actually from early last year, I think, this picture. And it's largely determined by the level of connectedness to the internet and to mobile devices or computers. But you don't see many borders. Broadly, roughly, I think mostly a consequence of economic policies. And these connections come through protocols for the internet. Things like TCP/IP, HTTP, simple mail transfer protocol, FTP, HTML, and so on. Protocols that are designed, that are international standards, that connect us, that network us, and they don't care about borders. We don't talk about sending cross-border emails. You just send it. If you're on WhatsApp and you're connected, oops, just happened. I switched it off. And if you're on WhatsApp, same thing. You're on your mobile device, you send a message. You don't care about borders, you communicate. We connected through these mobile devices, of course. 15 years ago, we weren't really. 15, 20 years ago. So we couldn't be connected. The technology stack's been built out to a point where we're now on these sites like social media, where also, interestingly, we migrate to international standards and apps that connect us. And we can choose which ones we want to use. So where a lot of people started out using Facebook, it's built up massive network effects. But suddenly you saw, as more people got on, the youth kind of switched out, and they moved to things like Snapchat, which will destroy your communications after you've sent a message, or into other areas. So there's lots more consumer choice. You get an international standard app or software product solution that's built, and people can migrate and choose whatever they want to do. We don't have a South African version of Facebook or WhatsApp or any of these things. Global, internationally recognized standards. That's what people want. They want the best. And they can get it. So what is money? Davy spoke about it earlier. Money is a societal construct that allows us to communicate value. It's a language that we use to be able to communicate value to each other. If I say to you, this bench costs 100 Rand, immediately everybody here understands what the value of 100 Rand is. You say to somebody from America, this is 100 Rand, what's 100 Rand? You've got to go and look at exchange rates, you've got to try and make sense of it. It's not a universally, globally understandable language at all. So like Davy said earlier, it's whatever we decide, we assign value to it. Through the market process, you get a value that's tradable, and you can understand that value from yesterday's market price. This is what the world of money looks like today. All these nation states, governments that control money, which in the information age just seems weird. Firstly, it's not programmable money, which is what cryptocurrencies are today, so you can build it into the internet. It's native to the internet. You don't need these security services where you need to transact using a banking platform, which is some third-party thing integrated into the web in order to facilitate payments. We can have internet money, which is what cryptocurrencies and tokens and these things are. So it seems very strange to me. In terms of the whole generational cycle theory I was talking about earlier, I think we're at the back end of a paradigm. We've had big central governments and authorities that are trusted, that manage money. But that's already beginning to change, and the next hurdle, moving into the information age properly, may be starting to accept internet protocols for value transfer. I mean, this is kind of like this, you know? What is communism about? It's about the state controlling the means of production. having factories and producing products that don't really give consumers choice, you're going to get the hammer and sickle product. Typically, not very good arbiters and allocators of resources. You get demand-supply mismatches, and you get massive economic crises. The world of capitalism is kind of different. We have all these choices. In fact, we've got so much choice, it's sometimes difficult to decide what we want. We'll Google and read reviews and do all these sorts of things. But we don't have it in the world of money. So this is, to me, where cryptocurrency comes in. These are protocols for the web to facilitate value transfer that people anywhere in the world can understand. All of these cryptocurrencies have unique features and functions. So if you want privacy, you can use cryptocurrencies like Zcash or Monero. If you want something that's more secure and maybe more stable in terms of storing value over the longer term, just because of the consumption of electricity, the cost is so high to go and hack the network, you're going to use Bitcoin. And you can decide. There's like 1,000 of these now, and I think it's still the early days of it. So massive consumer choice is coming to the world of currency, and it's not going to be constrained to nation-states, borders, or territories. It's going to be global. You can access them from mobile devices, and they're on these globally distributed networks. And effectively, the way that I think about it is that cryptocurrencies are social networks for money. They connect economies online. So, some of the tokens, we've got a lot of choice. So now I want to give some context to where this cryptocurrency market is. So we hear a lot of talk about it's a bubble, there's no value behind it. So let's look at this. So let's take the internet as an example. There's just over 3 billion people connected to the internet today. Come off of nearly nothing 20, 30 years ago, right? Over 3 billion today. Worldwide adoption of the internet. So it's taken about 20 to 30 years to get to where we are today. If you look at the trend of mobile, this is a breakdown of how people access the internet between mobile devices and desktop computers. You'll see mobile devices have just overtaken PCs last year as the favored means to connect to the internet. So about 1.5 billion people are now connected to the internet on mobile devices. There's around 2 billion people that don't have access to financial services, just to give you some ideas still. And I think that's largely people in poorer countries who don't have access to, registered addresses or identity verification, which is another very interesting application of blockchain that we can maybe get into in the Q&A. But let's look at Facebook as a social network. Transactions or interactions daily between Facebook users around 1.3 billion people a day. On WhatsApp, you're talking about 42 billion messages being sent a day. 1 billion monthly active users. It's probably 1 billion a day as well in terms of active users. And where's Bitcoin? Let's just talk about Bitcoin. We're talking about 700,000 transactions a day. 700,000 active addresses a day. That's back here, right? But now we've got the technology stack where this adoption can happen much quicker. In a similar way to Facebook or WhatsApp. You look at Ethereum. So Bitcoin is kind of like the brand. If people are going to get into the cryptocurrency space, they're going to get into Bitcoin. But what's the natural progression? As you understand this market more, you realize that there are different cryptocurrencies for different online economies. You start shifting into something like Ethereum. Ethereum's doing like 300,000 transactions a day. Active addresses, people who are actively using the network. You start going to something like Dash. I think Dash is the 5th or 4th largest cryptocurrency in the world. You're talking about 6,000 transactions a day. And Monero, which is a private cryptocurrency, 4,000 transactions a day. Now, an interesting thing is there's a professor who did a study on the value of these cryptocurrencies. He looked specifically at Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Dash, which has data going back far enough in time. There's a law called Metcalfe's law around the value of networks. It was initially applied to Ethernet and then widely used today for telecommunications company, which effectively says that the value of these networks is the square of the number of users on the network. In other words, if there are 300 of us in this room, 300 squared would be the value of this network because we have all these connections between each other. In the early days of internet, if it was just me and Andres who had email, you guys would all say, well, what's the point of this? You can't message us. Turned out to be revolutionary. The minute you got 300 to 300 connections, we can now open up this communication channel in an exponential kind of way. And I feel like that's where cryptocurrencies are today. So when people talk about, well, what's the use? Well, what was the use of email in the early days? Same thing. Metcalfe's law explains 94% of these cryptocurrencies as price moves in the last 4 or 5 years. In other words, it's purely down to adoption. Yeah, Monero actually had a fork back here in 2014, and I'm not entirely sure what drove turnover back then, but my more important point is just where we are in terms of overall transactions, and I just wanted a few slides to kind of make that point. The lead developer from Monero, interestingly, sits in Plet, South African guy, Ricardo Spagni. So Metcalfe's law explains 94% of the value of these protocols. And what's interesting from this professor's study is he says that never before have these networks had their own underlying value in terms of market cap that could be modeled. So you can now model what's happening with the price of Bitcoin or Ethereum in terms of its market cap relative to active users a day or the size of the network. Explains nearly 100% of the price moves in the last while. So this is just a picture of Bitcoin nodes around the world, active nodes a couple of days ago, so about 11,000 nodes. To my mind, in terms of the global economy, that's nothing. We know where in terms of this. So, I think the Internet of Money is here. It's here to stay. There's a paradigm shift that is in the process of happening. It's tied into a culture revolution where people can use the technology in order to design the kind of institutional arrangements that they want in their society, which makes it meaningful, and it means it can last for an entire generational cycle where this technology gets adopted. It will be interesting to see where people date the blockchain revolution, whether it's in 2008, which is pretty much when the current fourth turning cycle that we're in, which is the era I spoke about earlier that repeats every 8 years. That's dated to 2009 with the kickoff of the global financial crisis. Bitcoin was basically developed, the white paper was put out in 2009 as well. And I think it may be a thing of adoption. The point where this technology is widely adopted in society may be the point where the blockchain revolution gets dated. I'm not quite sure, but we're nowhere near that. When I look at some of the data in terms of users in South Africa, it's less than 1% of people that are on this network right now. A lot of people talk about it, and there's a lot of hype around it, but people just aren't really doing anything about it. I think what's going on partly is because talking about this stuff is like, it's this counterculture. It's kind of like punk rock, It's like going to a Sex Pistol concert in a way back in the 80s, And so when you talk about Bitcoin, people immediately push back and say, we don't like Bitcoin, but we love blockchain. Blockchain's great. And so in order to sanitize how you talk about this stuff, you don't talk about Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a lot of these public blockchains. You just talk about blockchain. And I think there's a lot of hype around blockchain. And the way that I think about it is, in the early days of the internet, when you had this revolutionary information superhighway, as they used to call it, everybody built intranets. If you remember those intranets, you didn't bolt onto the internet. We built these little intranets. And to my mind, that's what blockchain is. People are investing a lot of money in building these little intranets. But it's not really where this ultimately settles. But you've kind of got to talk about this, otherwise you're seen as this like fringe, counterculture, punk rocker kind of person in formal finance. Because it's not compatible with existing regulations. don't quite know what to do with it, don't know how it's going to play out, so you kind of wait for the paradigm to shift before you really get involved. So I think we're still in the very early stages of this revolution. It's a decentralized revolution, it's global, and 0.4% of the world is connected to it at the moment. So I think it's got way more legs than people actually think. That's not advice on price, at least in the short term as well. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks, guys.